Hi, good afternoon. I'm Carmel Martin. I'm the Executive Vice President for Policy here at CAP. And I am very excited to welcome you here today for this very important discussion about the causes of America's retirement crisis and to celebrate the release of this exciting new book, Retirement on the Rocks, Why Americans Can't Get Ahead and How New Savings Policies Can Help. Copies available for purchase in the lobby, and the book is by our very own Christian Weller. Today, more than half of working-age households expect to make substantial cuts in their spending when they retire, up from a third 3 decades ago. Millions of hardworking Americans will struggle as they age, and these worries will have ripple effects on their families, our national budget, and our economy. Retirement on the Rocks is the culmination of several years of research on risk exposure in retirement savings. Christian's research and writings combine applied economics with insightful policy lessons. Yale University's Jacob Hacker writes that few books provide a clearer picture of the problem and what can be done to fix it than Weller's deeply researched analysis. Christian is a professor of public policy at the McCormick Graduate School for Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He, more importantly, is a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress. Retirement on the Rocks demonstrates how policy failures have left Americans increasingly economically insecure, which in turn makes the labor, stock, and financial markets less stable. Over the last 30 years, federal policy has left Americans to sink or swim rather than offering them sturdier life rafts during tumultuous economic times. But it's not all bad news. Policy failures help create the retirement crisis, but they also offer solutions to help Americans achieve economic security in their senior years. Joining us to moderate a discussion about how we got here and what we can do to help Americans save more is Elizabeth Olsen, contributing writer for the New York Times. Please join me in welcoming both Elizabeth and Christian to the stage.
Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for coming today, and there's a lot of discussion and debate and differences of opinion about the state of retirement. Christian has written a book that is chock full of all the numbers that you could possibly want to do to look at, and but I think more important is the question of where we are going as a society, how much we are going to leave this to individuals on their own, or how much we're going to give them help. And I wanted to turn over the discussion basically to Christian and ask you just whether there really is a retirement crisis.
Well, my answer is unequivocally yes, there is a retirement crisis. The data, the research that we've accumulated over the last 30 years shows that a substantial share of households are ill-prepared for retirement. What does that mean? That means that when they reach retirement, they will have to make substantial changes in their lifestyle. My colleague David Madeline and I call that muddling through retirement. That can mean working longer in physical and mental health. That can mean relying on family members, moving in with family members, relying on the government. That can mean other cuts in spending, incurring substantial hardships, not being able to pay for the doctor's bills, not repairing your home, not paying your utilities. And what we know is that share of households, of working age households, is very large. One of the most, in my view, most reliable estimates from the Center for Retirement Research shows that in 2013, it was about 52% of working age households who could expect to make substantial cuts in retirement. More positive estimates put it probably around 25 to 35% even before the retirement crisis. But the other part of the retirement crisis research, and there's a whole host of literature on this, shows that the problem has gotten worse. And that is consistent either on the positive or negative side, on the optimistic or pessimistic side on the research. The Center for Retirement Research, for instance, shows that 31% were ill-prepared for retirement in 1983 compared to 52% in 2013. But other research from the University of Wisconsin and other sources also shows a growing share of people ill-prepared for retirement as society is aging, as the baby boomers are moving into retirement. And worse, you dig through the numbers, younger generations are ill-prepared than older generations were at the same time in their lives.
Okay. And as was mentioned before, there have been some books written about this and certainly scads of columns and articles. So what made you write this book?
What got to me was eventually I was fed up with seeing on my Twitter feed and social media and elsewhere yet another column that says, here's the 17 things you can do to have a good retirement. Like, you look around, you look at this presidential race, people are doing everything they can to tread water in their daily lives today, especially at a time of rising income inequality and rising income insecurity. Asking them to fix the retirement crisis on their own and suggesting it is their fault that we're in this mess, I think was wrong-headed. So what was missing was a storyline, an argument that showed that the rising economic insecurity that we've experienced over the last 30 years, increasing insecurity in the labor market, greater earnings volatility, longer spells of unemployment, declining benefits, at the time of increasing bubbles in the stock market and the housing markets, that combination, that led to the retirement crisis, that these outside factors contributed to the retirement crisis, especially since policy willfully ignored what's going on in the economy, the labor market and the stock market and housing market insecurities, or just simply failed to offer the right protections. So this isn't something that we should lay at the feet of America's middle class saying like, this is your fault and you have to fix it. This is a problem that policy actively contributed to over the last 30 years, and it is a time to rethink retirement policy on a comprehensive basis, and that's what I felt was missing from the conversation.
More Americans are exposed to the different labor market trends and the financial turmoil that we seem to be persistently having. How can we mitigate that risk exposure?
Well, the first part, I think, for risk exposure is really to well, there's different things. There's different separate answers. Let me say there is one part in the retirement world that actually works, and that is Social Security. Social Security is the one part of our retirement system that actually counters the effects of some of the labor market risks through its benefit formulas. It has some shortcomings, but it does sort of work against that. It is not exposed, thank God, to financial market risks and to housing market risks. So it is sort of the bedrock. And you look at some of the latest numbers we've seen, it actually works the way it's supposed to. It offers exactly the kind of protections at a time of rising risks. But as we all know, Social Security was never meant to be sort of the main thing in retirement, the main source of retirement. And I spend a fair amount of time in the book arguing that there is substantial space, especially in the American context, for savings outside of Social Security. It's just sort of, right now, our emphasis has been on let's get Americans to save and not worry about what happens with those savings the next time the market crashes. At this point, our bigger problem is that people don't save. It's like, well, it's sort of like missing the big picture. People don't save to some degree because they're afraid that their savings are going to be lost. But part of it is also, what good is it going to do if we get people to save more money and then the next market crash destroys it, or some ill-advised financial advice is laid upon them? So the main argument, or one of the main arguments I make in the book, is that we should emphasize increased savings. We should help people save, but we should be targeted about it. We should help the people who need the most help, give them the most help. But the other part is we need to have a constant, the constant conversation with that says, okay, we're going to ask you to save, we're going to give you incentives to save, but we're also going to give you the tools to protect those savings. And let me see whether I can sort of show some of the measures I mean. The first argument I make is we should, for instance, disclose the risk in retirement accounts. People say, like, well, people have a hard time understanding numbers, and I think that's wrong-headed. The main argument is we're already disclosing fees, and you can easily disclose risk, and you can disclose risk with little colorful thingies, a pendulum or a dial or something like that. You don't have to. The Rand Corporation tested 5 little red dots, for instance, like from 1 dot to 5 red dots for the Department of Labor in terms of risk disclosure. This can be visual. We know this works. In adding one little visual cue that this is really an unsafe investment or this is a safe investment will help people to manage the risk within their retirement accounts. The other part, and that's sort of like, I think, low-hanging fruit, greater risk disclosure. The other part is, Elizabeth and I were just talking. She used to live in Switzerland. I am German. Many people don't, or I was German until yesterday. I'm American now. So thank you. But when I was a German, and after high school, I was trained as a banker. And I worked in German universal banking. And one things we did when somebody bought a house was we said, okay, well, here's a mortgage. We're going to give you the mortgage, but at the same time, you have to sign up for a savings plan. There was nothing the next day for us to say we're going to enforce that. But what happened was people would pay their mortgages. At the same time, they would pay $20, $50 every month into their savings account, and they would build up home equity at the same time that they will build up savings outside of their home. And we told them, do that just in case something goes wrong. You fall ill, you lose your job, something else goes wrong. You have something that you can fall back on to keep paying your mortgage, at least for some time. And this is sort of part of the problem that we don't have that in the United States. We give people a mortgage, we encourage them to become homeowners, and we then turn mortgages and home ownership as one of the primary tools of retirement savings. And that sort of ties up a lot of money. But what people misunderstand is housing is an incredibly risky form of savings. So in order to protect that asset, to protect those retirement savings, the best protection is to have some savings outside of the house, to have some money in an emergency account. And so what I suggest in the book is, A, redo the mortgage interest deduction into a credit so that it is proportional to the money you pay, not proportional to your income, that it doesn't go up with your income. And then use some of the tax benefits, some of the credit, to put into a savings account that you can access for an emergency, to incentivize people to, while they're homeowners, to build up that emergency account. There's different ways you can structure something like this, but we need to think about protections consistently about savings. So when people save in their home, and people do save in their home, they think about saving in their home. They think that's they like it to a large degree because it's a forced savings. We then have to make sure from a policy perspective that those assets are there when people need them, particularly in retirement.
Given that you just alluded to the fact that our system, American system, seems to be kind of fractured in terms of how we even approach this. Do you think it's a good policy decision to make this more national, to have some kind of umbrella, or is it just a question of kind of organizing and coordinating what's going on now?
Well, I think both. I think there is room for some improvements to Social Security, for instance. There's some room for new savings forms, But I think the other part, but those can be fairly heavy lifts, not so much Social Security, but some of the other things. But one of the things that we know don't work is the proliferation of yet another savings incentive under the current tax code. We have 12 different forms of retirement savings accounts, and it makes an incredibly complex system. It stands in the way of people really doing the right thing, saving for the future. And look, there is bipartisan support, at least from economists who look at this, to simplify the savings world. This was part of the 2005 Tax Commission under President Bush. Most recently, in the summer of 2015, John Friedman from Brown University wrote another paper for the Hamilton Project about simply simplifying the savings account. That would be one way. I understand there's a lot of people who sort of like really are wedded to the idea, the division of 401ks versus IRAs. I'm not quite as convinced that works and that streamlining the rules, but fine. Have an employer-based and a non-employer-based system. Then you have 2 instead of 12. And the system becomes simpler. That's one thing. The other part I've argued, is let's move towards a tax code that actually helps the people the most who actually need the most help. Right now, the way our tax code works is if you contribute to a retirement account, it's a tax exclusion, tax deduction. We call it tax exclusion. You're never taxed, but the highest tax benefits goes to the people with the highest marginal tax rates. People who don't have any federal income tax liabilities don't get anything from the current system. Yet those are the people who probably need the most help. Lower and especially middle income families who work for an employer that doesn't offer a retirement system. And it's not just simply the fact that the tax incentives are tied to your how much income you have, so your marginal tax rate. It's tied to how much access you have to a retirement account. So if you work for an employer that has a 401k or 403b, you can contribute $18,000. This year, $18,500. If you, however, have an IRA, which a lot of middle and lower income people have, it's only $5,500. So even if you have the potential to save then more than $5,500, you then have to scramble, how do I make that happen? What kind of retirement system do I have to set up? So I think rejiggering the tax code would go a long way to help those people. What do I mean by that? In a report for the Center for American Progress several years ago, a colleague of mine and I laid out something called the Universal Savings Credit, which was the idea that you take all savings, all deductions, and convert them into one simple credit. Everybody gets it, and you can use it for retirement or for something else. That's sort of like the 30, 40-year vision. Obviously, that's not going to happen. In a recent conference here at the Center for American Progress, and I discussed this in the book, we talked about sort of the intermediate steps you could take. The first step would be to make things like the Savers Credit, which is already part of the tax code, right? Make it refundable. That means right now it's non-refundable. If you qualify because you have low income, you may not get it because you don't pay any income taxes. You don't owe any federal income taxes, and so you're excluded from it. That's non-refundability. You can make it refundable so it's not tied to how much federal income taxes you pay. That would be a big first step. You simplify it by making it automatic. People check a box on their tax return. Yes, I want this to go into my IRA, and you're done, and it would be a big step. My colleague, and I argued this also in the book, my colleague Joe Valenti and I have argued that there's a lot of room to create new progressive matches. So you give larger savings incentive to lower-income people and help them that way. The evidence is clear. Low-income people can save with the right incentives, and that comes from the tax code. So there's a number of those things that we can do, and I want to put a big pitch in here. It's not just the savings incentives, rejiggering them, making them better targeted is only one step. The other part is we do need to give people who work for an employer who doesn't sponsor a retirement plan the opportunity to save more easily for retirement. And I think right now the big wave is towards making the states be those sponsors.
Well, this was just debated and voted on in the New Jersey legislature, and Governor Christie rejected the legislature's recommendation, and now there is something in place now, unlike the counterparts in Illinois and Oregon and soon in California, that would make it completely optional for the employer. Does that work at all?
I want to be very clear. When the employers are offering a retirement plan, it works. I show in the book that the take-up rate, the ratio between what we call participation and sponsorship, is typically 80%. So 80% of people who have access to a retirement account will participate, regardless of employer size. Small employers, large employers. It's just that the small employers don't offer it. It's also, we've tried this. We've pushed and prodded employers. We've carved out safe harbor rules here and there. We've given them extra tax breaks and so on and make it as attractive as possible. And yet, we see, and I show this in the book, the sponsorship rate, the share of employers, the share of employers offering it is going down. The share of people working for an employer, even full-time, full-year employees working for an employer that offers a retirement plan is going down, has been going down since the 1980s. And more importantly, the money that employers put in for their 401ks has also been declining since the late 1980s. So we've done, I think, as much as we can. There are sort of little wrinkles where we probably should experiment a little bit in the employer space, such as the multiple employer plans under the right rules. But by and large, we should take the logic that we have in policy right now that sort of says the employer should be a partner. The idea here, the logic here is people on their own probably won't do all that well saving for retirement by themselves, so they need to have a reliable partner. Primarily, we've made the employer the reliable partner. The employers have proven to be less than reliable partners in this gambit, and so economists, experts have started looking for other partners. And it's not just state governments that we're looking at. The other one, you've got to remember, in the non-retirement space, policymakers have looked for charities and churches. In the individual development accounts, those tax breaks have to go through a charity, a nonprofit organization. There's other new experiments in the banking space, the lottery savings type, where you basically sign up for a savings account and it becomes part of a lottery. Those are also partnerships where you have an institution, a stable institution that knows what it's doing to become partners in the savings world. And I think that's sort of where we need to start looking. I think the employer system works well when the employers want to be partners, but increasingly the employers don't want to be partners. My friend Robert Roach sits in the back here, and we did a panel many years ago here on pension plans at airlines, and he made the point that airlines don't want to be financial service companies. And so the idea was that pensions work better if they're not directly attached to the company but are standalone, for instance, in the multi-employer world. And I think we can learn that lesson in the retirement, in the defined contribution world as well.
Okay, well, let's delve into Social Security, this main pillar that we haven't touched yet. This is something that's not really reached the center of the presidential primaries, but do you want to talk a little bit about the presidential candidates' views on this, as to what we know now?
It's interesting on the presidential campaign trail, and it will be interesting to see how the discussion changes. Social Security comes up here and there, but it hasn't been sort of a mainstay of the debates. There have been a flare-up during one of the presidential debates on the Republican side between Chris Christie and Mike Huckabee, On the Democratic side, the candidates are sort of going all in the same direction, but it hasn't been part of the discussion. It will be interesting to see whether that discussion, the momentum will change in the coming months, given the enormous downturn in the financial markets and the immediate uncertainty. We saw this a few months ago in September, October, November, when the markets downturned. There was real anxiety showing up in the polls about retirement savings and retirement and overall wealth. And we're far deeper into the presidential campaign at this point, and we're starting to begin talking about policy. So my guess is, but I've often been wrong about these predictions, that we would see a more detailed conversation about retirement, not just about Social Security. And I think voters will start talking about, asking questions about what will you do for retirement. Just to give you an example, I live in Massachusetts, so I typically, in at least my neck of the woods, don't get many political ads. That's sort of like, meh, Massachusetts, who cares? Sometimes I come close enough to the New Hampshire border that I get on the radio, a New Hampshire station. That's all presidential ads all the time. I tuned in yesterday into a Hillary Clinton ad, and the first thing that the ad said was, we're going to protect Social Security. It was like before a long list of other things. And that struck me as odd, because Social Security hadn't been part of sort of the conversation up to this point. But it says something about the state of the race in New Hampshire, I think. It was targeted towards the New Hampshire audience, and I did an AARP event in December for at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics for AARP on Social Security in tremendous audience. And I think the economic uncertainty that people feel, the anger that fuels some of the discussion in the retirement, in the presidential campaigns, is reflective of the uncertainty that people feel in their economic lives today, but also the worries about the future. And so I think that sort of as the field is winnowing down, I think we're going to move towards substance, and it will be first a discussion about what will you do about Social Security, and then it will be a conversation about other retirement savings. With that said, it's not at this point a clear Democrat versus Republican discussion. There is sort of a divide, even on the Republican side, on what do you do about Social Security. Not everybody is for privatization. Not everybody is for cutting Social Security on the Republican side. On the Democratic side, it's no privatization and no cuts. So let's put this to the side. But on the Republican side, you have people like, I know Mike Huckabee is sort of an also-ran at this point, but even Donald Trump is not a big rah, let's cut and privatize Social Security. I'm not a Donald Trump fan. I need to say this. I know I need to bill now these few minutes as something other than nonprofit. But by and large, there is sort of, I think, a reflection of the and realization in the presidential fields on both sides that a lot of the energy and anger that is driving discussion is fueled by massive economic insecurity. Today in the labor market, income insecurity, but also about the future, the loss of health care, the loss of retirement security. And I think as the field narrows down on both sides, we're going to move towards substance, and we're going to have a substantial discussion of what will you do to really protect my retirement savings?
Well, one of the things that I've only heard suggested by some Republican candidates is raising the minimum age, and to trigger your benefits. And there's already been a little movement there that's made people confused. The minimum age to get your benefits. It's now going up from 66 to 67, I think.
Yeah,
the
full retirement age.
The full retirement age.
There's two proposals here. We should say there's a proposal which is sort of endorsed, I think, by the majority of Republican candidates, as much as there are plans to raise the full benefit age, and it is an across the board benefit cuts that would disproportionately hurt people who need Social Security the most. All we know, right? It's an across the board benefit cut of for every year that the retirement age goes up. It's a 7 to 8% cut in overall benefits. The benefit cut, however, hurts lower income people more because they have to rely on Social Security more. They have shorter life expectancies than higher income people. They've also seen much fewer life expectancy gains. By some numbers, they've actually seen declines in life expectancy. So that's the wrong way to go. The other argument, and only one presidential candidate has come out with raising the early retirement age. Right now, you can get retirement benefits at 62, even as the normal retirement age is going up. And it's Governor Chris Christie who has proposed we should increase the early age. There is no good reason to doing that. It doesn't do anything for Social Security. It's really just, like as some of my colleagues and I wrote, it's just mean-spirited. It takes away benefits from people who need it the most, and it doesn't do anything. And it's this argument of like, we raise the retirement age and we'll force people to work longer. It's like, well, unless you have a substantial plan of how you're going to create good jobs for older Americans, this is going to like not do what you want to do. And we can talk about creating good jobs for older Americans at another forum.
Totally. How about the proposal to just double Social Security benefits? What do you think of that? As
I say in the book, I'm in favor of updating Social Security. To strengthen its main risk protections at a time of rising labor market uncertainties and rising financial market and housing market uncertainties. What that specifically means is, at a minimum, I would suggest a real anti-poverty benefit, improved survivorship benefits, improved divorce benefits, and an added progressive benefit at age 85. Those benefits are well targeted. They work extremely well. They would strengthen Social Security. They don't cost all that much. There's different ways of paying for them without deepening the hole for Social Security. But I shy away from a wholesale doubling of Social Security benefits because the one thing that I've learned over the last few years looking into aging and retirement research is that there is no such thing as like people flip a switch and turn into retirement. Everybody does it their own way. I say like there's 150 million people in the labor force, there's 150 million ways of retiring. I learned this from my sociology colleagues who tried to figure out whether there's patterns and then they can never find them. And I'm like, that's actually a very important lesson. That means people have different circumstances in their family situation, in their labor market situation, in their savings, where they live, how they want to live, what they want to do, and retirement savings should be there to help make that transition a choice, a meaningful choice. You cannot customize Social Security. So if you double Social Security, and sort of like a question of how far can you push it, but I think some improvements, some increases in Social Security are doable. Completely doubling it would probably push out too much of these individual retirement savings, of defined benefit pensions or in individual accounts. And there has to be this space for people to build their own retirement savings so they can stay in control. They can make the choices for their future that work with their lives. And the problem is that's sort of the philosophy that we have for our current retirement system. Government is spending a ton of money and effort on retirement policy. It just gets it wrong. And as I said, like it's complicated. The tax incentives are the wrong way. It's too heavily employer focused, and it sort of has shoved Social Security too far to the side. So I think the rethinking is necessary, but the rethinking has to put the emphasis where it's always been, a very strong foundation of Social Security with a retirement savings system that will allow people to create the future for themselves that they want.
Well, two of the things you just mentioned would have a very beneficial impact on women. The 85 and up benefit, also the survivors benefit. Do women really need that?
Yes. Women, I showed this in the book, but I'm hoping to do more work in the coming months on this. Women tend to have substantially less retirement savings than men. We know that. But the other part that we often ignore is, largely because economists focus only on one part of retirement savings, is that women have a lot more economic risk exposure. There's sort of this argument, this thinking like, oh, women, they're so cautious and they don't really do things, they don't take risks, they don't gamble on the lottery as much as men. I was like, really? Because the women I know are all big risk takers. Like meaningful risk takers. They have children. My grandmother was a refugee from Eastern Europe and during World War II. She packed up 3 little kids, put them in a horse cart, and fled. That's enormous, and hoping that there is going to be a better life at the end of the road. That's enormous risk taking, and making it work and making it happen. So the argument that women aren't risk takers by simply looking at how large is their stock portfolio is missing a huge chunk of the story for women. And when you look in, I do that in the book, but I've done this in other reports too, even just looking at the risk exposure that women have in housing, when women are homeowners, they have a lot more, their home equity relative to their income is substantially less because they owe more money, or they have fewer other assets outside of the house because they're lower income than their male counterparts. So their overall financial, their risk exposure, that something could go wrong, either the housing market crashes or the stock market crashes, is substantially larger than for men. But that's not the whole story. The other part is women tend to have more caregiving responsibilities. And that's, yes, women and men, like I have little kids. I love caring for my kids. And I'm glad I can share this with my wife. But many women don't. In many women disproportionately take on caregiving responsibilities while they're working. But something goes wrong. Schools close because there's a little snow on the ground. Your elderly mother breaks a hip or has a kidney failure or kidney stone or something like that. You have to leave everything and go to the emergency room. My wife and I are lucky enough that our employers let us do this. Most people don't. In that case, you have to take time off, often unpaid time off, to do this. So the risk exposure that women face is enormous across the economic spectrum. In targeting and improving Social Security with an eye toward, especially targeting women, is exactly the right thing. It strengthens the economy, it strengthens families, it strengthens women's lives.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I guess we will open now to questions. Just right here.
Excuse me, my name is George Gould. My background was involved in some federal legislative efforts to change the retirement of federal employees when the first program was created. And the reality was that besides the politics and ideology and philosophy, the reality was, frankly, thank you. The reality was that and I also serve on a board, I should mention, that has a lot of employees, and we went through this exercise too. And that was educating, motivating, getting the interest of the employees themselves in having a retirement program. The big challenge was that when we first started to educate people in Congress about the need for making change, the people that were directly affected took very little interest. And some even tried to avoid signing up for retirement programs. They didn't need it. Sometimes it was an age thing, but sometimes it was older. The question is, with your experience, have you discovered or do you know of a more effective way to educate our public as to the needs that they have for a retirement program?
I should come clean. I think I'm very skeptical about the more education. I think employers generally have a self-interest in educating their employees when they offer retirement plans. It's a benefit that they pay for. It's a structure that they offer. Sometimes it's in a union environment. It's even in the interest of unions to educate people to participate. And we know from the research, from behavioral economics research, why people don't, like, they understand it, they listen to it, and then they go on doing something else, and they don't act on it. Part of it because retirement is, at younger ages, such a faraway concept, and at older ages, it's such an overwhelming concept, right? If you're so deep in the hole that you would have to save 20% of your income and work till 70, it's like, well, I might as well just take my chances. So the solution, I think, is to simplify and automate as much of the retirement savings that we do. That we already did do this in defined benefit pension plans, but outside of the public sector, we don't have many private defined benefit pension plans, largely because unions have been decimated so much. That means we need to figure out ways to imitate what we know works in the defined benefit world in the retirement savings world. And part of it is simply automatically enrolling people, auto-escalating. That is, you start signing up at 3% of your pay the first year. And every year you work for an employer, your contribution rate goes up to 4%, 5%, 6%. In some cases, my colleague David Madeline even suggests going up to 12%. I think that's like making it automatic. I argue in the book that automatic investments that are sort of managing the risk for people, that is good default investments, also thinking about the long term, good payout options. That can be annuities or structured payouts, those kinds of things that the employee doesn't have to make all these decisions. The employee, when you ask them when they start, like, do you want to save for retirement, yes or no? And that's all you need to do. Like, there's not much education efforts and seminars involved, because even if people understand the information, even if they sort of hear it over and over and over again, the evidence shows that it's a long way from listening to an education seminar to actually making the right decisions and sort of making that decision as easy as possible. I think it tends to be sort of the best way of going about it. It does leave two challenges. I want to say this. The first one is, if we fix things in the 401k world or even in the IRA world, we still have this problem that so much savings goes to housing. And how do we get housing decisions right? How do we make sure that people don't put too much money into a house, don't risk too much of the house by taking out mortgages that are incredibly risky, and put this all together? The other part is, we can I think we can relatively easily fix sort of this education, the lack of education or the lack of acceptance of education within the 401k or IRA world. At this point, we haven't quite figured out what we're going to do once people start retiring. Because right now, our emphasis is on automate everything while they're saving, and then let people, when they're in the 60s or 70s, figure out what to do with the money. And one thing many people say, like, well, let's automatically annuitize everything. Let's turn everything into a lifetime stream of income. That's probably an ill fit for many people. So there has to be sort of a mix. I'm at this point, and I indicate this in the book, a believer in let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let the financial service industry tell us a little bit. What would be a low-cost, secure annuity look like that doesn't expose people to interest rate risk. And buying an annuity in a low interest rate environment like right now doesn't make that much sense. And a high interest rate, so there has to be a smoothing here so that you take out some of the market risk. The other financial service industries, companies have proposed other things, but let's experiment a little bit. But let's put an emphasis on risk protections during retirement, not just during the working years. So I think those conversations need to happen. I'm all for being comprehensive. I want to touch on one issue since I touched on this comprehensiveness. That is a big theme of the book, that I think we need to think comprehensively: Social Security, retirement savings, housing, as one pot of money that goes to one purpose in the end, retirement. Managing the savings and the risk that comes with that is a huge task. And sort of the one thing that I think is going to be very fascinating in the coming years is figuring out how you can economize, scale down financial advice that is disinterested, not self-interested, that is meaningful, that steers people towards the right decisions, and that doesn't cost thousands of dollars a year. And I think new technologies can get us there. But that's an interesting. There's a lot of experimentation going on. But I think that could be an interesting area and it needs to happen in order to make this fracture system actually work for Americans.
And part of that is engaging the financial institutions in a meaningful way. One of the things that I've discovered in my reporting is how most people are not interested, most financial professionals are not interested in the 5% a year that somebody who makes $40,000 a year has to invest. They want people where they're going to be able to make some fees from. And there's a huge resistance in the financial world, the way it's structured right now, to be involved in this at all. And then, and that is going to be another friction point that is going to have to be resolved.
But here, I think the government and governments, both federal and state, can be partners. Like the MyRAs that the Treasury offers sort of as incubators is one. The other way could be simply like the state programs, right? By requiring that employers at least offer payroll deduction into IRAs, you're immediately going to scale. If you simplify this, you streamline this, sort of like the Model T version, like we give you 3 different investment options or 5, and that's it. Or we don't even give you any options. You have 1. You save money and we pay you interest. Check. And when you have $10,000, we then, that stuff I think will be interesting, and I think could be and is interesting to a number of financial service industry providers. But I've seen the comments from some of the financial service providers to some of the new state sponsorship guidance from the DOL. I would say the financial service industry is very divided on this issue.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's totally true, because people who put their savings, they don't want to ride the rockiness of the market. They want to know if they put in $1,000, they're going to go back and be able to look that it's $1,005 or whatever.
I think that's, we completely misunderstand people's worries about this and the psychology that everything is fine when the market going up, but when the market crashes, people start freaking out and making really ill-advised choices.
Right.
Predictable, we all do, but.
Totally. I have another question. I'll go way back on the right side, the gentleman in the brown sweater.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Filler. I work for the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and thank you for the many years of fantastic work that you've done. I want to go back to a point that you made on the public sector and defined benefit plans. From time to time, it appears as though there's some degree of public commentary critical of the public sector and the benefits that they have. And it seems to me that we would all be better off if the boats rose rather than fell. As you mentioned, less people today have defined benefit plans than they did years ago, although there are more in the public sector that have them than the private sector. So can you comment a little bit more about that and how we maybe change the mindset collectively of the American public?
So a lot of public sector pension plans have come under attack, often with misleading numbers, but more importantly, often driven by extreme right-wing conservative interest groups. The National Institute on Retirement Security several years ago did a report where they highlighted sort of the discussions in a number of states about the public sector defined benefit pension plans. And what they basically said, like, look, this is not something that was driven by the voters. This was not driven something by economics. This was often driven by outside groups, and it often fell flat. They take Utah, for instance, as an example, which is not a particularly blue state, that maintained its defined benefit pension plan in the end. The important part is that often voters, we know this from the survey, like defined benefit pensions. There is, however, and I don't want to downplay this pension envy of, like, why should the public sector have this? And it is fueled to some degree by the media. I don't want to be a media basher, but it is sort of like this. We have this in Massachusetts of how many employees make over $100,000. And it's like, well, they're all neurosurgeons and police chiefs. They should be making $100,000 or more. There's a reason why we pay cops very well, because they're taking their lives in their hands for us. I don't want to run after bad guys with a gun. They do, and they should be paid for it. So part of it is we should have a reasonable conversation about this, and people accept that. I think people generally like pensions. People support pensions. They feel conflicted when it comes directly sort of to the bureaucrat who has a pension, but they feel a lot less conflicted when you say, like, well, should the police, should the firefighter, should the garbage man, should the person working at the DMV have a pension? People say, yes, 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 yes. The bureaucrats shouldn't have any pensions, but the other people should. And it's like, well, these are the bureaucrats. And so part of it is a little bit the framing. The other part is, and I've argued this before, you can take for those who work in the public sector pension space, you can take the pension envy argument off the table by saying, yes, we're going to defend the pensions for our public employees, but at the same time, we're going to work with state legislatures to create meaningful retirement security for the private sector workers. So the California options, the Illinois options, I think the unions, advocates for the public sector, they should all be in favor of creating meaningful, low-cost, low-risk retirement savings options. Something like California would probably be my preference over something like Illinois, but Illinois is a good step in the first direction. I don't want to.
But I think this really came to the fore. I think people used to think with pride that their state, for example, had a good public employee benefits. And then I think 2008 began to really change that. And people started thinking, well, you know, I'm really in trouble here. Why should this guy working at the waterworks make, you know, this grand salary and have all this comfy, retirement? And I think Christian is totally right that you have to even the playing field, or there's always going to be that kind of feeling. Okay, you with the right there in the front with the blue tie.
My name is Stephen Shore. I'm with the PBGC, and my question is, can the private sector defined benefit plan be brought back to life, or be given that how few people stay with the same organization for any length of time, the lack of demand by workers for private sector pension plans, the reluctance of private sector employees to maintain them, or is some other solution required? And is there any role for owning some of one employer's stock in one's own retirement plan?
Owning your employer's stock? Absolutely no. I don't want to give any financial advice beyond that. But since my book is about risk exposure, you want to tie your current well-being and your future well-being together rather than diversifying them. You work for Coca-Cola or Enron, where you have the majority of your 401k invested in employer stock. Look at what happened to Enron. It's ill-advised, and generally there's probably room for a little bit of money, but that's on the private sector defined benefit pension world. I don't want to sound too hopeless on this. There's still a lot of people who have them. There's still a lot of employers who offer them. I think there's sort of the defined benefit, the traditional single employer defined benefit pension world plan has a room in employers like it. You got to remember, this is a voluntary system. Nobody made employers offer this. So many employers offered it for a good reason. And the primary reason was it was a recruitment and retention tool. And then people's like, well, in the new knowledge economy, we don't need this. Like, really? Because every knowledge employer I know offers stock options. And they do exactly the same thing. They're meant to be recruitment and retention tools because they're vesting after a few years. They're just much more volatile and work much worse than the traditional defined benefits. So how do you get defined benefit pensions back? That's going to be a harder question. I think there's two things here. The first one is I think we need to think about how to strengthen and rebuild the multi-employer world. And that will require not just a retirement savings policy answer, but a labor policy answer that makes it easier for people to join a union. Because multi-employer plans, Taft-Hartley plans, do require the labor management partnership. There's other financial issues that need to be resolved, but I don't really see the multi-employer plans, even though many of them are very well run and work very well, come back without a strong labor movement. And then the other part is, especially in the single employer plans, we need to not have financial economists tell us that there is one accurate measure for liabilities. Right now, the way we do it is incredibly insane. That is, if the interest rate is 4% today and 5% tomorrow, your liabilities go through, 5%, 4%, go from 4% to 5% to 4%, your liabilities shoot up for no good reason. Even if you think we're going to be back at 5% in the next week, right? This marking to market, letting the market tell us what we could sell our liabilities for today, nobody does that, or very few people do. And they do it because we've pushed in this direction. Traditionally smoothing, averaging calculations of liabilities and assets over the reasonable lifetime of a plan, 15, 20 years, would take a lot of the volatility out, would make it much easier for employers to plan how much money they have to put into a retirement plan, and then making employers to actually contribute. That's true for the private sector as much, and even more so for the public sector, to actually pay the money into the system that they owe. But there are a number of steps we could take. The problem is that they go exactly in the opposite direction of where we've gone in the last 10 years. So unless there's a substantial rethinking on the pension side, and there are a number of pension representatives here, you may disagree with me, but I think we shot so much of our energy with the Pension Protection Act of 2006 that generally I don't feel that in conversation that much appetite to have yet another conversations about liability valuations, asset smoothing, and things like that. So.
The young man there.
Hi, my name is Adam Shazel. I'm with the Office of Economic Policy at the Treasury Department. So thankfully, I don't have to worry about saving for retirement just yet. But it seems like a lot of your proposals have to do with simplifying the tax code and making it easier for individuals to build up retirement accounts. Are you concerned with possibly crowding out employer-based retirement plans? Because, as you mentioned before, they seem to work really well.
No, I'm not. Employers have done that already without any help. They have been cutting back on offering retirement plans, and they have been cutting back on the money they're contributing. So I have taken a fairly clear stance in the books and other writings that I'm not worried about crowding out employer plans. Employers have already pulled back, and unless we want to go towards mandates, I don't see this changing.
The young lady back, way in the back.
Hi, I'm Kiana Greenpage. I'm with SEIU. And my question was regarding incomes and Social Security. I wanted to know, does your book take a look at how raising wages would actually impact Social Security? And if so, could you speak to that?
I can speak to this because we did a report on this last year, which I cite in the book, but don't spend too much time. At some point, the book got too long already. One of the problems that Social Security has faced over long term, its financial shortfall results not because its costs are going out of control. I always point this out. Like, if you look at Social Security's projections for the long term in 2033, the last year when it's still expected to have money in a trust fund, I think its cost is relative to GDP about 6%. In 2090, I think it's 6.1%. So it's not a cost explosion that Social Security faces. It is, however, it has faced a shrinking tax base. And part of that is that workers haven't gotten wage increases on average that have kept pace with productivity gains. That, on the other side, we have had stock market run-ups and incredible profit booms. The other part is we've seen, even among wage earners, increasing inequality, and we have this cap, $180,500. That is, if you make that much money or more, you stop paying Social Security beyond that. One of my colleagues has this line that says, like, if you make $1 million, you're done paying your Social Security taxes for the year sometime in the middle of February. So in that, the share of money, the share of earnings that is above that that threshold has been going up. However, the share of taxpayers has been going down. So part of it is, it's not just raising wages, it's also addressing and countering that rising inequality. It has hurt Social Security to a tremendous degree. Fixing that would mean raising the cap, and it would ultimately mean raising ways for people to better participate in the economy and reap the fruits of their own labor. That can be done through a higher minimum wage, paid time off, but also more ways of joining a union. Ways that tie wages, allow workers to actually see real wage gains when the economy does well.
Okay. Yeah, way in the back.
My name is Robert Roach. I'm formerly the co-chair of the I Am National Pension Fund, which is an overfunded multi-employer pension plan. So I'm a big proponent of defined benefit pension plans. And I want to thank you, Christian, for writing this book. It's a lot of good information and having this debate, because it's a very important debate that we're having. The Social Security and the pension discussions are important, not only for seniors, is because a lot of young people are going back home because they can't get jobs, and a lot of people are going home to help their families. So they're living off this pension check and the Social Security check, and in some cases, diminishing. The question I have for you, deal with annuities in here, some of your discussion about it. And assuming that we have this one savings plan that you discussed, multi-employer plans now can't offer any of that. They can offer 401ks, but they don't offer annuities. And some of the discussions out there are having people be able to contribute, and employers contribute to a multi-employer plan on a defined contribution basis, and then at the end having the employee be able to default into a defined benefit. Have you given that any thought, and what are your thoughts about that?
I think there's some interesting experimentation, and if I remember the Pension Protection Act correctly, there are some ways you can do this in the public sector. I think it was only the security, so police, firefighters, if you have a plan, you could buy into an existing public sector pension plan. In fact, Massachusetts, for professors, has both a defined contribution plan and defined benefit pension, and they just went through this at the state level where they gave us the option to buy into the defined benefit pension. I think there is, it's clearly something that people want because it gives them a lot of security. It has, there's a difference between taking a lump sum that you have in 401k or 403b and then bringing it over to the defined benefit pension and buy into and then get an annuity, or you contribute on a regular basis. The main issue is that we often underestimate the enormous interest rate risk with annuities. Look, if you retired in the early 1980s, you won the generational lottery when it came to annuities. If you're about to retire in 2015, 2016, yeah, that's not a winning lottery ticket. And there are ways of doing this. But the idea is to, and this is sort of like the one issue that is difficult to replicate in the defined contribution world, what pensions, both private sector and public sector and multi-employer plans do well. They take money in on a regular basis. They self-annuitize, so there is this smoothing. They don't take on that interest rate risk because it's not there. They don't go to an insurer, like increasingly they do, unfortunately. But traditionally, the one big thing is that pensions, both multi-employer and single-employer plans, have this market smoothing mechanism that they can pay from the good times into the bad times in trying to recreate that through the defined contribution world is very difficult. So if we allowed somebody to buy on a regular basis into credit, into a defined benefit pension, at least as part of their defined 401k, I say like 25% of my 401k contributions goes to buy credit in my local defined benefit pension, that probably would be an interesting investment option, and to be honest, cheaper than what the financial service industry is cooking up right now, which is, I forgot the name, I think I have it in the book, it's called total return funds. It's basically like trying to have an individualized market risk smoothing investment option in your 401k. They're trying to sell it. And they try to convince me at all these conferences, like, it's going to be really cheap. I'm like, they can't be. You're buying hedging and futures and options and everything. Like, even if you get the risk management right, it's going to cost you an arm and a leg to doing it on an individual basis, unless you somehow lock the individual in for 40 years, which the individual doesn't want to do. So I think we have had these conversations. There's a number of other groups who are pushing to sort of mix and give people more access from the defined contribution world to the defined benefit world, particularly through the multi-employer world, either the multi-employer world, Taft-Hartley's, or the public sector plans.
The gentleman right behind, yeah, and then you could be after him, but he had his hand up for a while.
My name is Murad Egbal. I was previously at the University of Baltimore Center for International Comparative Law. Thank you for your contributions. I have two questions. The first question is, you talked about your background in banking, and in banking, you always have a consideration of opportunity cost of money. So if you're entering into a savings plan, and the savings plan, let's say, pays a % per year, if you're young and you start early, you might benefit something from it. But if you're 65 or 70 and do it, over the lifetime of the individual retiring, benefit and risk merge until the time of death, because then it's immaterial. So I would like you to say something about that part. And the second question I have is, even though I don't have the benefit of having read your book, but even though all considerations are dependent upon the legal regime we're dealing with here in the United States, The problem you describe is not unique to our society alone. There are two passages in a book by the Fourth Revolution that discusses how Singapore deals with retiring population, China, Sweden, and other parts of Europe. So is there a comparative component that you either cover in your book or will cover in your future work that says, hey, here are other societies, they approach the same issues in a different way and perhaps more successfully? Thank you.
Let me take the second question first. I do make sort of a passing reference, but I'm generally not big on the comparative side. As I said, I come from Germany. I understand the German system. I've written about comparing these various systems. We spend as much or more on the welfare state in the United States as the Europeans do. We just do it in different ways. We don't do it directly through transfer payments, Social Security, Medicare. We do it through the tax code, which is a much bigger emphasis in the United States and thereby individualized. I think there are some countries, mostly Anglo-Saxon countries like UK, New Zealand, and Australia, who are sort of comparison points. But it's not just the legal system. The legal system we have in the United States is reflective of some of our cultural values here. And a heavy emphasis on individual decisions and choices is something that I see hard changing. And sort of saying like France does it this way and Germany does it this way doesn't really help us, I think, for the policy discussions here. I think I find it more productive to say like, we've made the decisions to help the individual saves, we just do it the wrong way. And then coming back to your first question of depending on when you start, market timing matters. Yes, it does. And it is I find it, this goes back to the point I made to Robert, it is a big challenge of how you recreate that out in the defined contribution world. I don't want to make this sound like there's defined benefit pensions and defined contribution plans. There are hybrids. There are sort of proposals that come from the financial service industry, but also from think tank types like my colleague David Madeline, and I described this in the book, where you do have some market smoothing. So the timing when you take this generational lottery, you take it out. To some degree, you reduce it. Right, the generational lottery means how much retirement security you have to some degree if all your money is in a 401k depends on when you're born, because markets, especially stock markets, goes in these 20, 30-year swings. It's not like with a 401k when you hit age 65 and say like, well, I really had a bad market run. I know a good one is coming for the next 30 years. I'll stay in the market for the next 30 years. That's just not, you can't do that. And so I think so that these hybridization models that, as Robert suggested, possibly buying into a multi-employer plan or a public plan or a new pooled investment that has some sort of self-annuitization at least is considered for California. Those are new interesting options and should be on the table.
Okay, here.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to talk about your book in terms of the credibility of retirement systems and how a lack of confidence in saving for retirement plays out. And I'd like to put it in the context of, and I'm probably wrong with the Teamsters representative in the back, but there are several pensions that are in the process of reducing their benefits to existent retirees because of underfunding. And there are several states that are looking at unfunding some very clearly promised benefits. And while economists may agree, regardless of political stripe, on some aspects of Social Security, the Speaker of the House is committed to privatization, which undermines the credibility of people in Social Security. So if I was looking at a 20-year-old niece or nephew of mine, and they said, should I save for retirement? I'd say, wing it, travel and, go to Sweden, have the time of your life, because whatever is out there, you can't control. So how does your book deal with a sort of a lack of credibility given the retirement rocks?
Um, I don't address it, but let me address it here. The first one is on Social Security. You got to remember, I always, like Paul Ryan might want to privatize Social Security, and a number of presidential candidates might want to, and they pull out numbers and say like, well, 50% of Americans don't have confidence in Social Security. We had a president who looked exactly at those poll numbers and said, like, now is the time to privatize Social Security. And that was George W. Bush in 2005. And he misread the numbers. The people, it's sort of soft concerns about Social Security. By and large, people want Social Security. They support it, especially the people who are nearing retirement and who are politically active. Social Security is going to be there. And the fact that we can go through this. People will say like, well, it has money in a trust fund, and the trust fund is funny money. It's like, well, it's Treasury securities, and there's nothing more secure than that. You really think the U.S. government is going to default on payments it made to seniors? You want to see the pitchforks coming out? That's the way of doing it.
I'm sorry, but I guess that's really my question, because those kind of statements about privatization, the people in this room may not believe them, but if you went to rural Wisconsin or rural Nebraska or rural Iowa, they would believe them. And so the continent, and they know Teamsters who are, I think it's Teamsters, that are getting less benefits.
I'm going to address that, yeah.
They see, they hear, they're saying, I don't buy it. I
Yeah.
don't buy it. Because that's what I
On Social Security, there is always going to be a part of people who don't believe it will be there. There's always going to be a share of people who want to privatize it, but it is the minority of people across the country. They tend to be younger. As people near retirement, their support for Social Security is much stronger, and their confidence in Social Security is much stronger. It's been around for 80 years, 81 years this year. I think, given what we went through, what I've been through in my 20 years here in Washington, I've had 4 different Social Security privatization discussions. Social Security always came out on top, so I'm much more confident about Social Security than that. On the public sector pension plans, or the pension plans in general, the underfunding issue, I wish it would go away. I wish we wouldn't have the unfunding issue, some of the silliness that goes with it. But the first one is no state, to my knowledge, has ever defaulted on its promises to its citizens. That's not true for municipal pensions. There's a few of them, but states have never defaulted. The other part is there are policy solutions, and we should push for them. The main one is we make employers, the states or local governments, contribute what they promised. And I think to some degree that has also ailed some of the private sector plans. And there are ways of getting people making contributions. I also think that some of this discussion is going to go away very quickly once interest rates start rising. But that's because then the liabilities become much smaller, and all of a sudden the underfunding disappears in these numbers. The other part is when it comes to the confidence issue, I think is, I call it risk exposure and worries about risk. People are worried to a very large degree about what's going to happen to their money in their 401k. And I think the big argument in my book is we can raise confidence in that among people that the money will be there by sort of making risk protections an integral part to our policy. That is, we tell people how risky it is, how not risky it is. This is a safe, this is a risky investment. Do you want to really invest that much money in risky stuff? And also create new ways of protecting that. And be that through annuities or structured payouts or default investments, there's a number of ways we can do this. But risk protections, safeguarding risks, safeguarding savings, can no longer be a sideshow. It is a huge chunk of what worries people in the world, especially 401ks, and I think we need to take that serious. And then I would say on the housing side, I would go exactly opposite direction, tell people how risky their housing is. You don't believe how many conversations I have with PhD economists telling them that housing is actually a very risky investment.
Did you have a question?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I'm Sandy McKenzie of the Journal of Retirement. Christian, you know Nari Ree probably pretty well, and she coined the very felicitous phrase retirement crisis deniers, referring to a number of people whose names I will not list, but whom you know. I've read the first 7 chapters of your book, and it's great. However, I couldn't find a discussion of their particular views and why you might think they were wrong. So
I want to be careful not to. It's those who deny that there is a crisis sort of play fast and loose with some of the numbers. They don't actually address in many ways the bulk of the existing literature. They sort of try to shift the goalposts to something else that I often say, like, they're winning a debate that nobody's having. They're not actually addressing the bulk of the retirement crisis literature. There's no other way for me to respond. Well, there's 2 ways to respond. The first one is the numbers. The bulk of the literature, all of the serious literature on retirement preparedness, since at least the early 1990s, some of it dates back before then, but Douglas Bernheim in 1992 is probably the first one, shows that a substantial share of people are undersaving, not well prepared for retirement. I used to say it's about 30 to 40%. In the last 5-10 years has gone probably to 50%, 40 to 50%, give or take a little bit of wiggle room here. The second part is, even in the one study that the crisis deniers are using, even that research has shown that the share is growing to 25% of households being ill-prepared, or 26%, right before the Great Recession. That's a substantial share. If you think that that's fine. If you don't want to call it a crisis, call it a problem. But it is a big problem. Especially, we're talking about rising share of the fastest growing population share in the United States. So you're multiplying the problem. It's like, and then finally, saying there is no crisis is talking, I think, past people. You look at the numbers on inequality and economic insecurity that are reflected in what we see right now in the presidential campaign. This insecurity and fear that then feeds into the anger that drives some of the candidates' support comes from somewhere. And basically saying there is no crisis is also telling the vast majority of people, you're delusional. It's all fine. If that's sort of your message, that's your choice. I think politically and realistically and data-wise, that's just going in the wrong direction. But we can talk about it afterwards, Sandy. Like the main thing is that, especially the two people we have in mind, are generally, they're making reasonable arguments on data points and other things that have nothing to do with the existing evidence. They're sort of missing they're not really addressing the major argument, the major research literature.
Did anybody else have a question? You, go ahead. I think we have 1 minute.
Notoriously, some large employers have gone through bankruptcy and washed out their pension obligations. We protect lenders by not letting student loans be washed out through bankruptcy. Should we protect pensioners by preventing companies from washing out pension obligations through bankruptcy?
I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer. I think pensioners should have a higher standing in bankruptcy court. But that's only what I know from the private sector. In full disclosure, my wife used to work for a union, and we used to work on pension bankruptcies at the airlines, and sort of I'm somewhat familiar, if I remember this correctly. Clearly, I think pensioners, retirees, workers can have a better standing. I don't know enough about city bankruptcies like Detroit and others. Yeah, the airlines were notorious, but you got to remember, the one sort of safeguard that the airlines had were the unions. It was U.S. Airways that went into bankruptcy and actually came out with a pension plan by joining the Machinist International multi-employer plan. Was it U.S.? Yeah, United did. Yes. So there was some backstop, but you're right. There could be better legal protections.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all.